Good afternoon. My name is Julia Graham. I'm the Deputy CEO and Technical Director at Airmic, and I am delighted to welcome you to this seminar on top risks and megatrends for 2020. We're going to be taking from 2 o'clock up until 3:30, and we will have a number of panelists that I will introduce you to in a moment. But first of all, I'm going to take you through some of the logistics. And the first one is I want to make sure that when we start to speak, you know how to ask questions. So if we can go to the next slide, if you want to ask a question, and it will be a richer session if you can feed questions through to us, this is how you do it. Please go to the questions panel in the GoToWebinar console. And if for any reason the console isn't visible, then look at where the orange arrow is and click to expand it, and you should be good to go. So that's how you're going to join us. In terms of the format for today, I'll just walk you through what this is going to look like. We're going to take the first 10 minutes or so to go through introductions, the report overview and demographics, who the panel is, who they are and what they're going to focus on. We're then going to turn to each of our panelists to make some short presentations, and we'll go through those based on a topical flow, and I'll introduce our panel and their subjects shortly. We'll then move on to moderated Q&A, so really important that you feed your questions through so that we've got a vibrant session. We want this to be interactive, and we've allowed plenty of time to do so. And then towards 3:30, sort of 3:20, we'll be running a summary, mentioning some of the issues that have come out of the seminar. It would not be a seminar at the moment without mentioning something about the pandemic, but we'll talk a little bit about this, and then leave you with some information about where you can go for further information. So I think we are good to go, and I'm going to start the ball rolling by talking a little bit about Airmic's survey report for 2020. This highlights the risks and megatrends impacting organisations and provides the context in which our risk professionals are operating today. The report walks us through how we can navigate 5 risk megatrend areas and their connectivity, which is an important feature of today's world of managing risk, and the effect of a crisis such as a pandemic on other risks. Finally, the report goes through to talk about how insurance buyers, insurance brokers and insurers should be encouraged to work more closely together, especially during times of crises. I'd like, before I go any further, to thank our survey partners, AIG, Control Risks, KPMG, QBE and Willis Towers Watson. Without you, we would not have been able to produce a report to the quality that we have. I'd also like to particularly thank my colleague, Ho Young, who is our research manager in Airmic. He's done a fantastic job in producing this report, reconciling all the different views, and is a special thank you to him for making that report happening, and with my colleague Matt making today's seminar happen. So thank you both very much. The survey partners have also helped to provide their insight to the survey conclusions and their thoughts on the specific megatrend areas that the report covers. In addition to their contributions, it's also based on responses gathered through a survey that we ran with Airmic members from the middle of February through to the end of March this year. And of course, just to remind us for context, that period coincided with the period when COVID-19 was beginning to hit Europe, from the first cases reported in northern Italy until the end of the UK's first week of lockdown. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I'm going to take you in this slide and for the next couple of slides through some of the demographics, just to let you know who the audience was involved, particularly in the survey. And I'm going to focus on the Airmic members involved. Airmic members hold typically leading positions in the risk profession from amongst some of the largest businesses in the world. Just over half of our respondents are heads of risk management or insurance for their organisations, and many of them have also got a responsibility for purchasing insurance. Most of the professionals who completed the survey come from organisations with a global turnover of 1 billion to 10 billion or above. So large organisations and sophisticated organisations. Moving on to the next slide, this looks at some of the survey demographics. So there's an even spread, but 34% of our respondents come from organisations with more than 25,000 employees. And from the next slide, you will see that there's an even spread also across sectors. If I move quickly onto slide number 5, then I'd like to just sort of linger a little bit on some of the demographics in terms of, who are these risk professionals? Now, one of the things I think we were all pleased to see was that the survey indicates evidence of a growing pipeline of female talent in the profession. Younger risk professionals are proving more likely to be female, while the gender balance generally amongst those with up to 15 years in the profession is today just about equal. Now that's actually quite a big difference, and we've been able to plot that difference over the years that we've been running surveys, and we're pleased to see that we've reached that balanced place. This also is reconciled. We produced another survey in March of this year, which we published, called The Future of the Profession. And what I'm pleased to say is that our survey hasn't just produced these statistics in isolation. They're very much backed up by what we found in March. Now, as we entered the year, if we can think back to, yes, what did that start of 2020 look like? Risk professionals may have been kept awake at night thinking about cyber risk, perhaps coloured by outstanding uncertainties about Brexit and issues particularly associated with climate change. And all I can say to you here today is what a difference a few months can make. With the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been unprecedented disruption to business and daily lives. And I think I can safely say that that's disruption that we have not seen for decades. Now, disease was a known risk, and it's been on risk registers for many years. And some organisations have been extensively prepared for a pandemic. But I think from talking to our members, what caught many by surprise was the scale and the geographic spread, and the sheer velocity of how COVID-19 covered the world. And I think it's those two features of scale and velocity which took many people by surprise. And in that context, what members were saying to us, we had some qualitative roundtables with members as well to support the survey. And what people were concluding from this was that great leadership, fueled by managerial agility, were the two key factors in helping organisations to manage an effective response. Not plans, however well written, but potentially gathering dust with responses that took too long to ignite. But however well leaders performed, or however well teams responded, organisations today still continue to grapple with uncertainty. And that's the scenario that we go into our next slide, which is talking about what keeps people awake at night. Now, I quite like to call this slide the risk game, because it is actually quite a good game, for want of a better description, to play with senior leadership in your organisation, to say, well, what are the nightmare headlines that are going to keep you awake at night? Our survey respondents were asked to imagine a headline in the news that they would dread reading when they most woke up in the morning. Now, we've sort of run this type of question to our members before, and as before, many respondents naturally revolved in their answers around the coronavirus outbreak, which was in its early days in the UK and Europe when we ran this survey. So I'm not particularly surprised that people did that. And soberingly, many of the scenarios in those imagined headlines relate to the virus outbreak that has subsequently surfaced. So a little bit of a prediction there, sort of unfortunately coming true. Using techniques like this is an incredibly helpful thing to do alongside the more traditional risk registers that organisations have, and indeed are expected to have, so that alongside that, you can think the unthinkable. And headlines are a very easy and simple way of doing that to help stimulate boardroom discussion, and one which Airmic members are increasingly likely to use, as our research indicates, in their increased level of engagement with their C-suite and the board. So a useful process to keep up your sleeve, and certainly one that should complement, if not replace, what you otherwise do. So moving on to the next slide, what are the top risks that risk professionals and their organisations face? And here we've got a summary of what happened as the UK went into lockdown in March. And at that time, risk professionals were most concerned about the risks of business interruption following a cyber event, followed hotly by the loss of reputation and brand value, the same top two risks that they were concerned about in 2019. Disease and pandemics did actually feature in fourth place amongst lists of concerns, so it was definitely there, but for the reasons we've said before, perhaps didn't feature as highly in terms of probability in many risk registers or lists of risks as they should do. Cyber risk has loomed large as a front of mind risk occupying risk professionals for some years, and that's clearly intensified during the pandemic as a vast swathe of employees began to work from home and access to important data was no longer restricted to the more secure environment of offices. And of course, when there's a change of environment, opportunists are always there to take advantage of that situation as well. Political uncertainty had kept risk professionals up at night for much of last year, given its propensity to bring about unexpected regulatory and legislative changes. All causes to disruption to supply chains, still a hot topic, and very much a hot topic after COVID-19. And the geopolitical situation in the past few years has been especially tense and volatile. Now, to some extent, that's taken a back seat as an issue of direct concern, though risk professionals should not underestimate how the challenges and frustrations of the pandemic could wreak havoc politically in the near to medium term. And this is further explored in the Megatrends section of this report on geopolitics and popularism. Turning to the next slide, risks and megatrends, from a list of the 5 megatrend areas, survey respondents were then asked to assess the extent to which each of these would be of concern to them and their organisations over the next 3 years. They were asked to do this on a scale of 1 through 5, where 1 was not a concern and 5 was very high concern. And then an average score was calculated for each megatrend sub-area. There have been some dramatic shifts in the relative position amongst the megatrends, especially those relating to geopolitics and popularism and climate change and environment, which took more of a back seat in 2019. And that was particularly true, somewhat to our surprise, on climate and environment. Now, one thing I want to mention before we sort of move towards the end of what I have to say, and that is the subject of connected or aggregated risk. Connected risk is a term that we've become more familiar with over the past couple of years. And as an illustration, cyber risk, which ranked at the top of the megatrends table this year, often contain a significant geopolitical element. No risk or megatrend is an island. The megatrends of societal change and unrest, generalized trade disputes, outbreak of war and tech wars now feature lower on the list of the megatrends. However, regulatory uncertainties, a feature of Brexit, has risen to 5th position, and we know it's still going to be there in the next few months as we lead through the period of transition. And the global economic outlook as a megatrend is now 3rd highest, ranked up from last year. Now, COVID-19 has delivered a devastating economic shock to many countries, and we're going to hear far more about that as plans for different governments unfold to get us back to what we might consider the next or the new normal, whichever expression you prefer. Now, finally, going on to insurance, we represent a lot of people who are very sophisticated buyers of insurance. And the report addresses how insurance buyers, brokers and insurers are working together, particularly during times of crisis. And I think for some, we have to lament that maybe on occasions those partnerships have not worked out as well as we would like. And we'd like to see better examples of collaboration and working together. You know, Airmic members are important risk buyers. Their estimated total annual insurance spend that we represent is around 10.5 billion. It's a heck of a lot of money and a very big percentage of the UK general insurance market. However, increasingly, Airmic members report that the lack of adequate insurance cover at an affordable premium is now in many risk registers a risk in itself. And I think in the many years that I've been in risk and insurance, that's the first time that I've actually seen unavailability of insurance that people would like to buy featuring in risk registers. It's more typically there as a control. So all sectors of the insurance industry need to work together to learn the lessons that result from the current crisis. And we know there are a number of initiatives which are ongoing to do that. And Airmic is in the middle and supporting a number of those. But crucial will be the rebuilding of confidence and trust among businesses, reinforcing to society the vital role that insurance plays in supporting and protecting people against the day-to-day risks they place. We need a conversation about how to make insurance cover for pandemics and other systemic risks more widely available and affordable. Our survey suggests that current markets are already forcing organisations to look at alternative transfer options, and an ill-judged response to the pandemic could detonate the whole mix. The insurance industry is at a crossroads, and research tells us, however, during previous pandemics, that the level of innovation was proportional to the level of disruption they caused. So, insurance industry now is a vital period for innovation, for seizing opportunities to innovate and not retreat. So that's a quick run through the report. The report is available on the Airmic website, and I hope that you will, those of you dialing in today, will enjoy reading it. But I now turn very importantly to our panel. And I would like to introduce our panel to you. And I'd like to start off by doing that by saying that they are a panel of experts nominated by the survey report sponsors. And the panel today are going to discuss the survey report through the lens of cyber, trust, geopolitics, governance, and resilience, and provide some insight into the observations and conclusions of the report. So thank you for being here, panel. And I'm now going to go through and introduce all of you in turn. Now, unfortunately, Elizabeth Braw, our first panelist, can't be on screen with us today, but she's definitely here, loud and clear, and will be taking part in our Q&A shortly and making a short presentation. Elizabeth, welcome. Elizabeth is a Senior Research Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, and focuses on geopolitics and popularism. Elizabeth directs RUSI's Modern Deterrence Project, which focuses on how governments, businesses, and civil society can work together to strengthen countries' defence against existing and emerging threats. She's a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and the Times in London, focusing on European defence and security. Elizabeth has been a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford, attended university in Germany, and holds a Magister Artium degree in political science and German literature with a dissertation on nuclear weapons reduction in Europe. Quite an interesting combination, Elizabeth. So it will come as no surprise that Elizabeth is a published author, and her book, God's Spies, about the Stasi, was published just last year. I'm then going to turn to John Meakin, who is a cyber security advisor, the cyber CISO, cyber and technology is what he is going to focus on today. John is an information and system security specialist with 30 years experience. He retired as the Chief Security and Risk Officer at Burberry in 2017. And since then, he's advised various businesses on cyber risk, including as an interim Chief Information Security Officer at GSK and CISO at Equinity PLC. Prior to Burberry, John was also involved with the luxury goods conglomerate Richemont International SA in Geneva, where he oversaw physical, information and cyber security. And before that, he built and led security functions in the Royal Bank of Scotland, Dresdner Bank and Standard Chartered Bank. He's also been a Chief Information Security Officer at BP and Reuters. He has a PhD in experimental solid state physics from Cambridge. And when not fighting the good fight, he tells me that for better cyber security, he plays five-a-side. He plays five-a-side football, classical music and jazz. Welcome, John. I'm then going to move on to James Endersby, who's Chief Executive of Opinium Research, and he's going to focus today on resilience. As CEO of Opinium, which is a fast-growing insight agency, James works closely with clients from a variety of sectors in the UK and around the world. Taking over the reins while still in its startup phase, he's grown the agency into a major industry player, working with 22 of the Fortune 100 and focusing on 5 core practice areas of brand and communication, product and service development, stakeholder understanding, thought leadership, and market understanding. James previously worked for the management consultants Monitor Group, now Monitor Deloitte, and was based out of London, Delhi, and Boston. 3 words that sum you up, James: passionate, enthusiastic, and supportive. That works for us. I'm then going to move on to Dan Truman, who is Global Head of Cyber for Axis Insurance, and Dan is going to focus on trust and reputation. Dan serves as the Global Head of Cyber and Technology for Axis Insurance, a business segment of Axis Capital Holdings Limited. He's an experienced multi-class underwriter with expertise in cyber, reputational risk, intellectual property, supply chain insurance, political risk, contract frustration. The list goes on. Is there nothing, Dan, that you don't have a background in? Even marine, hull, piracy, physical damage and energy. You sound just the man for the panel today. Prior to Axis, Dan served as the Chief Innovation Officer and Unit Head for the Cyber Division of Nove, which he did from 2014. And Dan was also previously at AMV, where he was lead underwriter for their Enterprise Risk Division. Prior to that, he spent time at Kiln, most recently as an active underwriter of the Enterprise Risk Division of Syndicate 510. Dan studied for an MBA at Henley Management College in the UK and a degree in archaeology and anthropology from the University of Durham. And words of wisdom from Dan: failing to prepare in this environment is preparing to fail, and it's the surest route to mediocrity and organisational failure. Wise words, Dan. And then we move on to James Cooper, who is our final panelist for today. James is a partner at Clyde & Co, and he's going to focus on governance, laws and regulation. James's practice focuses on all aspects of D&O and financial services, and he's got extensive experience in acting for directors and officers and financial institutions on contentious matters in a number of jurisdictions. Much of this has involved arbitration and cross-border work with an international connection. He's currently involved in defending a director in one of the few derivative actions to have been given leave of the court to proceed. And he's also involved in a number of catastrophe claims, particularly class actions emanating from the US and financial product mis-selling. James is admitted to practice in England and Wales and Hong Kong. What a fantastic lineup. So now I'm going to turn to our panel, and I'm going to ask you to make a short presentation on the subject that you're going to focus on today. I'm going to ask all of you to turn your cameras off at this stage. and we're going to focus. It's a bit of a blank screen actually, so I'm going to stay on the screen myself so Elizabeth doesn't feel alone. But Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to you, and then in turn I'm going to turn to each of the panel before we then go through to our Q&A session. Elizabeth, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia, and yes, thank you for staying, remaining on the screen, so I don't have to present a completely blank screen. So it's a pleasure to join the event today, and if there's anybody there from Willis Towers Watson, thank you very much, Willis Towers Watson, for putting my name forward and for being such great partners of RUSI. You're obviously you work very well with a number of organizations, including Airmic. So at least in this small world of insurance and risk, I think we are one happy family, but the world is not such a happy family. So a few things I'd like to talk about, and I just have to refer very quickly to an interview I heard the other day on the radio. A New York Times reporter was interviewed about a number of policies that President Erdogan of Turkey had introduced, and he was asked why President Erdogan had introduced these policies, and he said, well, the word populist comes from popular, so because he wants to become popular, he introduced these policies. And I sort of wanted to say, actually, you should have studied Latin in school. The word populist doesn't come from popular. It's two words that both come from the word that we in English call people, and so populism refers to this new development, which is really not new at all, but that we are seeing much more clearly now, where leaders are being elected based on essentially sloganeering, and that's what we've seen with Trump, but also a number of other leaders. I won't mention names, but both at the national and regional level in a number of Western countries, and even if they haven't been elected leaders, they have their parties have gained significant power. What does that mean? Is it just annoying? No, it's not. It's not just annoying to the establishment. It's actually a radical change. So, for example, one of the areas that are flagged up in Amex report is the U.S.-Chinese relationship. Well, the reason that it's deteriorating is that after Trump was elected, China all of a sudden faced a leader and an administration that was populist, that didn't shy away from labeling China's actions unfair or worse. And that's something that we have known for a long time, that China engages in unfair actions. Both the Chinese governments and Chinese companies, which are, of course, by extension linked to the government, they engage in unfair practices vis-a-vis Western companies and Western governments. But we haven't really dared to say anything. We've pleaded with them. The Trump administration didn't have any such scruples, and still doesn't. And it is very blunt, too blunt perhaps, and that's why we have this situation that we have today, where we have a new tech war between the US and China, or an emerging tech war. And by the way, if I can recommend, the BBC had a fantastic documentary on the new tech Cold War a couple of weeks ago. I was honored to participate, but more importantly, a number of key personalities in the industry, including Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google and chairman of the US Defense Innovation Board, participated. So that's one area. Then trade disputes, and I'd like to bring standards into that. And standards sounds terribly boring, and it is boring, but that's another area where China is using what one might call underhanded tactics to gain power in the world. So and it's something that I won't go into detail now about now, but it's worth looking up after we finish the seminar. But the world so far has essentially organically agreed on standards, from electricity to currency to what have you, based on what worked best in a pragmatic sense, and often it was American standards, but in many cases it was not. China has a concerted plan to establish standards that then every other country will have to adhere to, simply because China has been so clever in pushing it through. That's another geopolitical development that is below the level of armed conflict that we are seeing. So what unites all these different areas that are in the report, including trade and cyber, is that it's all latent aggression below the level of armed conflict, which means the countries that are targeted by it can't easily respond, because how do you respond to an action that is not obviously aggressive in nature? It's just it's what is called salami tactics, a little bit here, a little bit there, and all of a sudden you're faced with a fait accompli. So how do you respond to that? It's very difficult, which is why, of course, we're seeing more of it. Climate, that's an area where Willis Towers Watson are doing fantastic work, and I'd like to commend their really fantastic thought leadership. Something that annoys me is that in the world of national security, climate change is often seen as a tree hugger issue. It's not a tree hugger issue at all. It's an existential issue. It's a national security issue. It's a societal security issue, because if we can no longer rely on the climate to keep us relatively healthy, then the precious goods that we now take for granted become much more difficult to obtain, and that includes water, and we'll have many more conflicts on top of what we already have. So I'll stop there, but I'm sorry to paint such a bleak picture. Just one more thing that I'd like to highlight, and where I think we'll see developments, is China's actions vis-a-vis minorities. And I'm not just talking about how shabbily China treated Africans during the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, which made African leaders unhappy, even though they had many African leaders had been quite happy to work with China. But now what we are seeing is China's concentration camps for Uyghurs, and that's something that hasn't been taken seriously. It wasn't taken seriously for a long time, and now it's becoming a standoff between China and the West. And the question is then, will China retaliate against the West for standing up for the Uyghurs? So even though it's not an insurance issue as such, it's an area where Western action in response to Chinese action could lead to more escalation. And I'll stop there.
So, Elizabeth, thank you very much for that. We're going to cover questions after all the 5 panelists have spoken, but I'm going to ask you a very quick one here. And I don't know if you can comment on this, but it sort of segues on from what you were talking about. And that is, do you think the UK are right, therefore, to have concerns about Huawei and their involvement in 5G? Or should we, given the nature of what they're going to do, should we be more relaxed? Do you have a sort of view that you can share on that?
Yes, I do. And I hasten to add, I'm not an engineer myself, but as you might imagine, as part of my work, I've had countless conversations with engineers in the industry, and they, for the most part, are relaxed about Huawei and about the security issues involved with Huawei participation in 5G. But I don't think that that's even the key issue. I think the key issue is Huawei's connection to the Chinese government. And yes, it says it's a private company, but you just have to follow Chinese government Twitter feeds, and you'll see, and listen to press conferences or press interviews with the Chinese ambassador here in the UK, and you only need that to see that it's not just any company, because the Chinese government is already threatening to retaliate against the UK if the UK reverses its decision on Huawei participation. And I think that is the big problem, that if we have Huawei as part of our 5G infrastructure, we become vulnerable to Chinese blackmail. So if we do something that the Chinese government doesn't like, then it can instruct Huawei to work against our interests, or Huawei or its suppliers, I should say. So it just seems to me a very risky proposition to have a company playing such a vital role in something that is really a public utility, while not being sure that the country and the government with which the company is involved has our best interests at heart.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, and a very open answer, which we appreciate. So thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn to Dr. John Meakin, who is now on the screen. I'm going to take myself off the screen, John, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Julia. But before everyone believes that I only exist in the cyber world, I do actually play physical five-a-side football rather than cyber football. But also thanks to Control Risks for inviting me to speak to the report, section that they contributed on cyber security. They're of course an excellent collection of deep risks, including cyber, and I've had the pleasure of working alongside them in the past. So as the report itself identifies, cyber risk has loomed very large in the minds of risk professionals of all shape and size for some years now. We've all experienced, either directly or via the headlines in the media, how cyber insecurity can cause serious damage to businesses, both tangible and intangible. What I'd like to talk about today is just to bring out some of the more recent flavors of cyber risk and how they're developing, but also put those in the context of the current COVID emergency and what that has done to the way we use IT and electronic information, and how that therefore emphasizes the need for a coherent approach to managing cyber risk. And then I'll go on to talk about some of the challenges in those approaches and some of the opportunities. So in terms of the latest flavors of risk, I mean, it's undoubtedly the case that individual and corporate exposure to cyber attacks is expanding. And this parallels just the pervasive use of always on, always networked computer devices in every aspect of our daily lives and our daily business lives. But in particular, more recently, we've seen artificial intelligence, again, another useful enabling developments in the cybersphere. But we've seen AI techniques, other advanced techniques being progressively exploited, not just to improve security, but to damage security, particularly on the part of nation states and organized criminals. Organized criminals have become very heavily involved in cyber insecurity in the corporate and business world over the last few years, because basically they can make money from it. Meanwhile, sort of aggregated risk, systemic risk is growing in the cyber world as a result of our concentration in the way we use IT on a number of smallish, a small number of large tech giants that dominate the world: Microsoft, Amazon, Google, you know the names. And there's no question that those with a malicious intent recognize that concentration risk and therefore are developing attacks which would aim to focus maybe not directly on the giants, but on those services that are layered on top of those giants, because they can have a magnified impact as a result of that concentration risk. Equally, some technologies which haven't historically been the target of either cyber attack or indeed lots of corporate energies in securing them, such as the technology that we use to control manufacturing production lines, oil refineries, drilling rigs, and so on, what we generally call operational technology, that is being targeted now, particularly with a view to the sort of extortion-based attacks, ransomware, because it is so important to the continued operation of a business or the provision of a service or the maintenance of critical national infrastructure. And those technologies as I said, have not historically been the subject of great efforts to keep secure. Therefore, there's a lag. There's a lag in the approaches to securing them that needs to be tackled. And then, picking up on some of the themes in Elizabeth's talk, nation states have become more active and more overtly active, more brazen, if you like, in their uses of cyber attacks, cyber offense, to achieve a geopolitical gain, or even a commercial gain. Although the nation states aren't often targeting specific businesses, there is huge scope for business to be involved as collateral damage as a result of those activities of nation states. And if those of you will recall the summer of 2017, there was a wonderful set of examples of what can happen in that respect under the guises of the WannaCry attacks and then the NotBetcha attacks that occurred within a month of each other. So cyber is a real risk. I'm just picking out some of the latest trends. Basic insecurities still exist. Now, what the virus has done, and this is the real virus, the biological virus, is that it's accelerated the move to businesses using the technology, the cloud-based technology, the social network technology, the mobile computing technology in ways that really are stretching the traditional approaches within large corporates that have been secured by traditional maxims as to what is secure and what isn't secure. And indeed, you could argue that we'd all be very seriously at a disadvantage if we hadn't allowed that to happen. How would you operate your business if you weren't able to remotely connect all of those home-based workers into your central systems? And those central systems are now connected, or now making use of everyone's home network. So it is bring your own device, the BYOD, that has been one of the subjects of discussion for some years now. It is the realization of that on a huge scale. So technology remains even more in the center of doing good business today. But what has come along with that, of course, are more stresses and strains on the way we achieve the security of that technology. So why don't we just rise to that challenge and deploy all of our cybersecurity techniques and manage adjust to a different level of appetite to meet those challenges? Well, we are not historically very good at managing cyber risk. Cyber is still poorly understood in the C-suite and the boardroom, despite the efforts of those experts, risk experts in the cyber insurance industry. There is still a dearth of really concrete data to quantify cyber risk. And in the absence of data, a lot of misunderstanding and misapprehension rules when it comes to businesses' decision as to how to dispose their resources on keeping the business secure. So we still hear phrases which are frankly not credible in the modern world, such as "we have a zero appetite for cyber risk." You cannot have a zero appetite for cyber risk and still run a business today, particularly post-COVID. Quite often, cyber is seen as a series of point fixes, or even a project that has a definite start and end, rather than a continuous aspect of risk management. Very often, of course, the role of people, the central role of people in being cyber secure, is ignored. And very much, of course, legacy IT gets in the way. It is always more difficult to secure legacy IT. And yet, of course, there's still a fairly common maxim in the boardroom and in the executive suite, which is if the IT ain't broke, we won't fix it. And what you're taking on with that is an uncontrolled level, an unacceptable level, I would suggest, of cyber risk. So what can we do to respond to this challenge and do better, thrive even in the post-COVID cyber environment? My suggestion would be under three headings. We have an opportunity to thrive. We need to fine-tune our risk management strategies making them recognize at all points the external political and regulatory landscape and how that is driving the broader corporate risk agenda, including cybersecurity. And that is not only taking account of the nation state threat, but is also taking account of issues such as the ones Elizabeth referred to in relation to trade wars and the control over technology and Huawei and so on. Cybersecurity risk management should be treated as just another aspect of business risk which is ever present and requires the same rigor and discipline in management. And the assessment of cyber risk must mature into a holistic approach, building your response to cyber based on joined up risk scenarios rather than point assessments of risk, like all of our data must be encrypted. Instead, think carefully, deeply about how your data might be exposed, and then decide from a palette of measures as to whether you need to encrypt or do something else. It must be data-driven. We cybersecurity professionals must get much, much better at gathering data. It must therefore use the data to track continuous performance measurement and improvement. And the risk appetite and the journey towards managing the risk with an appetite must be a realistic one. So that holistic approach is my second point. The third point, and this is brought out very strongly in the report, and it's something I truly support, and that is there is a bringing together of the cyber and physical security disciplines, which offers a real opportunity for improvement on both sides. The cybersecurity side has an opportunity to learn from the deeper expertise in the human factors of security that exist already in the physical security profession. People factors are still key to cybersecurity, to the way you use IT and electronic information securely. People factors in assessing the motivation of attackers are also key to understanding what the actual level of risk is. Are the organized criminals going to attack you? And who are the experts in organized crime already on the ground? They're the physical security profession. And blended threats, physical and cybersecurity threats, do indeed occur. So two sides of the security professional, physical and cyber, can come together, collaborate, maybe even in the same organization. That's not necessary. Close collaboration is the goal. And that can improve monitoring, physical security and cybersecurity together in joined up security monitoring centers. It can improve, as I said, in the assessment of the risks and the overall strategic management of risk. If I have one message overall, and this is again brought out in the paper, is that people still are at the center of cybersecurity, and the way people are behaving now post-COVID is something that the risk management profession needs to respond to effectively to keep business secure. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Some very wise words, and I am still also myself figuring out how we do cyber-side football. So I'll come and have a chat with you about that later, John. But
all right.
really interesting comments. We're putting up quite a collection of questions, but I'm going to save those because I'm anxious that we move on to our other panelists. So, John, we're going to say goodbye to you at the moment, but don't leave us permanently. And I'm going to ask James to activate his webcam and come onto the screen if he would. There he is. Thank you, James. Platform's yours.
Brilliant. Thanks for the very kind introduction earlier, Julia. I'll try to be my usual passionate, enthusiastic, but virtual self today. I'm delighted to join in such a fascinating conference, so thank you. And thanks to QBE for inviting me onto the panel to contribute. As Julia mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about the topic of business resilience and its importance in an increasingly unpredictable world. In January of last year, we teamed up with our client, QBE, to develop the Unpredictability Index. And there's a report on that, which I believe will be shared afterwards. And we looked at metrics within 5 key pillars relevant to QBE's clients, and collated sources across QBE's key markets, with the overall objective to pinpoint the most and least predictable year of the past 30. And the markets we included in our index were the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Canada, and the Nordics. And just to quickly explain the 5 pillars. So firstly, the first pillar that we looked for data under was the political pillar. Obviously, as you can imagine, incredibly important. And under this pillar, we look at data on the volatility of elections, the clarity of election outcomes, policy uncertainty, immigration fear, geopolitical uncertainty, etc. Then in the business pillar, areas and data around the volatility of key stock market indexes by country, volatility of currency values, survival rates of businesses, etc. Then there's the economics pillar, which really pulls in our ability to forecast inflation. Of course, looking backwards, we could work out how accurate we were, and our ability to forecast GDP growth and changes in unemployment, etc. And the volatility of core economic measures like interest rates, GDP, and inflation. And then there's an environmental pillar, which clearly is incredibly important too. The volatility of temperature changes included in there, volatility of rainfall and climate-related mortality. And then finally, the societal pillar, which really explores changes in consumer behavior, changes in societal behavior, and the changing demographic profile of the market. So those 5 pillars, we combine the data from them, and when mapped over the last 30 years, shows that the world, as you might imagine, and as you've witnessed, is becoming a less predictable place for businesses. Almost all of the least predictable years in the index have occurred in the last 20 years, with the majority during the last 10. And interestingly, the research also showed that periods of unpredictability come in 5-year cycles. And the next peak was expected to hit in 2020. And so even without coronavirus, 2020 was expected to be an unpredictable year for businesses anyway. We then also went on to conduct over 1,000 attitudinal surveys amongst senior business leaders in those countries to try and understand how businesses feel about unpredictable events and how they plan and how they cope with these unforeseen events. And so really to try and understand how resilient businesses are or were back in 2019 in January when we ran this work. And as mentioned, this research was conducted last year before the coronavirus pandemic. And when analyzing the results at that time, even then it was concerning to see the levels of complacency that businesses had. Many felt highly optimistic about their ability to deal with unforeseen events, despite not many taking the steps needed to mitigate for risks. Just a few, drawing on a few bits and pieces from the report, 3 in 4 businesses felt positive about their ability to deal with unpredictable events, but only 29% had risk management plans in place for such events, while even less, 17%, had carried out stress tests. Smaller businesses in particular had higher levels of complacency. 1 in 3 sole traders, for instance, told us they did not plan for unseen events. But even among larger businesses, the picture was not great at all. Only 45% of large businesses had developed a risk mitigation plan. And on top of all of this, only 1 in 3 businesses had put money aside in case they needed it, and only 1 in 4 had insurance in place for unforeseen events. So fast forwarding to 2020, already supposed to be an unpredictable year, and the world is, of course, a very different place, with many businesses sadly struggling to survive right now. At the start of the lockdown, my team at Opinion started running a bi-weekly business distress tracker, which is a survey amongst 500 business leaders every 2 weeks, and from businesses of all sizes. And we'll be running this and monitoring how businesses are doing, hopefully right out to the other side of the recovery. And as you can imagine, sadly, as expected, the recent wave of our tracker, which was last week, I think, now widely reported in the media, revealed just how fragile businesses are, with many sadly at risk of insolvency. None of this obviously is a surprise. But some of the data here, more than 500,000 businesses, 544,000 businesses are currently at high risk of entering insolvency as a result of coronavirus-related disruption. And that's up from 510,000 in April when we started tracking this. Of course, the picture does vary considerably across sectors, with service sector firms at particular risk, for instance. What is also concerning is the average anticipated recovery time of businesses overall. So that's the time that they expect their business to return to pre-crisis levels, which is now sitting at 31 weeks to recovery, which is almost 8 months. And that has been creeping upwards since we first started tracking that. Back in April, it was at 7 months to recovery. So I think really that obviously this pandemic has also shown that agility and flexibility play a big part in business resilience. For instance, at Opinium, at my business, we were able to immediately switch to working from home as soon as the government announced businesses should take that step. And as a result, we never lost any days work because it was managed in such a way that our team was able to immediately switch on from home. So why is that all important? Why is this all important? Because preparation is, of course, key to building resilience. Organizations that survive and succeed in an environment of enhanced unpredictability will most likely be those that are best prepared, obviously. But of course, it's hard to prepare for every single eventuality. But if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown us, it's that businesses need to think about the worst case scenarios and take sufficient steps to try and mitigate the impact of big risks. The QBE Unpredictability Index report shows us that businesses could have been better prepared, as I mentioned the results from the survey earlier. Of course, adding to this, businesses can't prepare for every possible scenario, and clearly COVID is an example. So of course, strong leadership and a resilient workforce are also key. So investing in the hiring process, of course, makes sense for businesses, and then coaching, training, and developing teams so that they are still able to function when a crisis strikes is also important. And then so too, obviously, is the ability for the business to remain agile, to be able to pivot, and have the ability to devolve decisions to those colleagues on the ground, and of course, having the required flexible systems for all your people to navigate in the first place. So finally, we're slowly coming out of lockdown with businesses reopening, and the focus is very much on recovery. However, a potential second wave could well happen before a vaccine is available, resulting in businesses closing again for a period of time. And so all this is clearly something businesses really need to be immediately focusing on and factoring into their risk planning in the year ahead. Thank you.
James, thank you very much. And we're going to make the predictability report is available, so people will have access to that as well. So James, we're going to call you back when we're ready for questions, but I'd like to now welcome Dan Truman. And Dan, I'm going to pass over to you, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Julia. I want to say thank you, like everyone else has, for a very kind introduction. I always think that those bios, need some work. I must talk about my five-a-side footballing tendencies, which I don't expect are nearly as good as John's. So something to work on. I also want to say thank you to KPMG, who were kind enough to support me and bring me in to discuss this area. My specific area here is to throw some light on and unpack one of the areas that this survey, which is I really think is an excellent piece of work, starts to look at, specifically reputation, what creates it and what breaks it. I think one of the things I really love about the survey, before I go into that, is, Julie, you framed it really well, is the breadth of experience, the breadth of industries represented, the breadth of knowledge that comes into. And it's interesting how consistent some of these results are. But along the lines of what Elizabeth was saying, I think we talk about reputation as a new megatrend. But I think it's really important. This goes back. This is not a new thing. In fact, one of the Waller and Younger, who were quoted within the survey, who wrote a brilliant book called The Reputation Game, quote at the beginning of their book Publius Syrus, who says a good reputation is more valuable than money. And he passed away in 43 BC. So we go back quite a long way in looking at reputation and its importance. But in a modern context, we do accept that reputation is essential. It drives customers through the door, it brings shareholders on board, it attracts and retains talent, it has a wide variety of needs, but it also enables the organization to be resilient, as James has just been talking about, and to work through the challenges that the organization is inevitably going to face, and to survive the crises that are inevitably going to come for any organization, whether external or internal. And I think that's also important to recognize that the sort of changing face. And I think when we look at so many of these mega trends that we're looking at, it's the intangible nature of them. And specifically the lens in this instance, the intangible asset of reputation. Some excellent work has been done on this. There's always an off-quoted survey by Ocean Tomo that looks at the inversion of intangible asset to tangible asset since 1975 to 2015 in particular, where intangible assets used to represent in the mid-70s about 15% of an organization's stock value. And by 2015, only tangible assets were representing 15% of an organization's stock value. And that had totally changed. And a significant proportion of that valuation is obviously the reputation of an organization and what it does and how it does things. So, and it's really important that we've seen that inversion, but it also is important to remember that reputations are made over an age but destroyed in a flash. And I think that's really key, and a key aspect of this, particularly with the lens that sort of is often used in this, the capability of an organization in how it survives reputational challenges, and the character of an organization in how it survives reputational challenges. Apple's a really good example of this, where, for instance, in sort of from the launch of the iPhone, certainly from iPhone 3 through to iPhone sort of 6 or 7, everyone was followed with a gate. We had battery gate with the iPhone 4. We had sort of how to hold the phone gate with the iPhone 3 launch. There were a number of challenges with the actual capability of building this piece of kit, but the character of the organization, the way consumers responded to the organization, the way consumers felt about the organization, particularly the character of sort of Steve Jobs at the helm of the organization, was key to the resilience of the organization against those challenges. More recently, we've obviously seen a challenge with Boohoo, where the capability of producing clothes at sort of low costs has specifically been challenged when it's found out the character of the organization and how they were going to do about that challenges the preconceptions of how appropriately that is to manage. And we see voting with their feet, not least of people who are buying wholesale from there, but an ongoing challenge and the stock price valuation change that brings. So I think that character versus capability is a key lens to use when talking about organizations and reputation. It's also, I think it's really important when we look at this, what's the risk management lens, and particularly when we're looking at within the Airmic context. I think close collaboration, this is really important, where it requires proactive risk management to properly understand the risk of an organization, the risks an organization is facing in a reputational sense, and what might affect it. Because we've seen this from both what Elizabeth is saying, what John is saying, what James has been saying, and I have absolutely no doubt that James Cooper at Clyde & Co will unpack this as go forward, particularly with the C-suite issues, is that we absolutely need to, the networking effect of that organizations face, the fundamental risks, the wide variety of risks mean that things, many things can affect where an organization is perceived. Which means, for risk managers in particular, that close collaboration with risk owners to understand the challenges they face is absolutely essential. And I think that also needs a joined up approach, or it can easily backfire. We've seen many instances recently, maybe of let's say the oil majors, and we talk about this in the report as well, where they want to embrace a green agenda, but it's been very easy for non-governmental organizations and others to point out the reality of the green agenda and how that doesn't necessarily exactly reflect what's been produced on the ground. So you need to be very strong in capability and even character indexes to survive those sort of challenges. I think it's a process as well to truly understand sort of reputational assessment and reputational value, and that's sort of something that's always a challenge when we're looking at intangible asset risk and risk transfer, and particularly using the lens as I have as an underwriter trying to offer products and have discussions on this and look at the risk management of this. We need to follow a process of identification of the risks, then qualification of those risks, of those what does that actually mean, and for whom are we doing it, and why should we be doing it, and then quantification. So it's IQQ or IQ squared. I think it's a really good way of following that, because I do think valuation is difficult, but certainly not impossible. And then, because once we've evaluated, we can then look at how to transfer. And I think the insurance industry has been trying to do this, but it often gets a little sort of garbled in some of the challenges, whether that's historically reputation risk was on the sort of disgrace policies, Sharapova losing huge amounts of contracts after, having failing a drugs test, that sort of disgrace policies. And around the PR elements. But what we also really should be talking about is customer attrition, the business interruption impact of a reputational event or a negative reputational event. I don't think this can be achieved, and I think Julia summed this up really well, without collaboration across industry, without conversations, without understanding what's actually going on, and without looking at how we can build better, more proactive products for the future that actually affect the real trends that we're seeing in the industry and the problems we're seeing. I think not least because this is an issue associated with some of the complexity of non-damage business interruption, which is obviously right at the forefront now. But I think because without assessing the genuine impact of this, the severity, the frequency, the resiliency and the recovery of organizations and around their reputation, we can't collaborate to offer effective risk transfer. And I really look forward to the continuation of this conversation, this debate, any questions that are coming out of here. And any questions that anyone wants to ask going forward. So thank you, Julia, on that point.
Thanks very much indeed, Dan. And we will come back to you in a moment and start some questions flowing. But before we do, I'm going to ask James Cooper, who is our final panelist, to take the stage. And then after James has spoken, we're going to come back to you and ask you some questions that have been flowing through. James.
Thanks, Julia. First of all, thanks to AIG, one of the sponsors, for asking me to take part in this, and also thanks to Airmic for laying on such an interesting panel. What I've been asked to do is to try to bookend the panel to talk a little bit more around where this is leading to for law and regulation, and to try to look for a couple of themes that we see in the liability space, particularly focusing upon Ds and Os in the C-suite rather than necessarily the corporates themselves. And what the Airmic survey quite rightly identified was increased regulatory activity as a concern. 2018 in the UK saw significant regulatory and corporate governance reform, and this ever-evolving risk landscape sits within a time of great uncertainty for companies and their directors and officers. With these continued uncertainties, we see Brexit on the horizon, what that's going to look like, what does cyber resilience look like, what does COVID response look like, and that's placing increased demands on times and resource. In the UK, directors face a wide range of regulatory exposures, and they're actively being held to account. FCA figures show that more and more investigations are being opened. They're lengthy, they're costly, and large fines are being imposed on directors, being just a number of consequences for them. Other consequences can include suspension and disqualification, removal from core responsibilities, or even, albeit rarely, jail time. This has been heightened by the senior managers regime. That's heralded more actions against directors, but it isn't just the FCA. Directors can and do face actions from multiple regulators in this jurisdiction in relation to the same root cause. So the pensions regulator, the FRC, other professional bodies like the SRA and the ICAEW, if the directors are professional. With the rise in international cooperation, directors can also find themselves subject to parallel foreign regulatory actions. In addition, there's been a broadening of corporate criminal liability in recent years with the introduction of failure to prevent offences in the Bribery Act, Criminal Finances Act, etc. More such offences currently being mooted. Whilst those offences apply to the corporate entity, directors and officers may face knock-on prosecutions, having been identified as the wrongdoer by the corporate in the course of cooperating with regulators to agree things like deferred prosecution agreements. Looking in a little bit more detail then at three real areas of concern: corporate governance, cyber, and compliance with the evolving digital regulation, and then just following and finally looking at some class action issues. In relation to corporate governance, the FRC's UK Corporate Governance Code came into effect on the 1st of January 2019. It had the aim of improving corporate governance. Consequently, the burden of compliance has increased, and there's a couple of points to note here. There's a risk that companies will follow the letter rather than the spirit of the code, resulting in boilerplate disclosures that won't provide useful information for investors and stakeholders, nor meet the government's intentions. Many of the changes may require new processes that will then be reported on, and the regulations require information at a group level, and that presents a logistical challenge and requires careful thought as how best to collate this information. Due to the comply and explain nature of the code, non-compliance with the term of the code isn't itself a breach. Failure to explain is, and this approach does rely on shareholder engagement to challenge non-compliance where appropriate. Failure to implement and keep under review adequate policies and procedures to capture the required information can also be a systems and controls issue, and we are seeing some actions by the FCA in relation to systems and controls failure. The provision in the code to understand and respond to shareholder concerns, especially 20% or more vote against a resolution, places the onus on companies and the board to take into account shareholder grievances, and we may see increased shareholder activism where shareholders apply pressure with the aim of persuading the board to change its mind. We may see an increase in derivative actions by shareholders. That's a massive issue in the US and Israel in particular. It's unlikely to be a significant risk in the UK, but even one or two more derivative actions will put fear through Ds and Os across the whole of the country. Corporate governance considerations have expanded, and they should now include addressing diversity and inclusion and preventing modern slavery in the supply chain. The code also requires boards to undertake a robust assessment of their organisation's principal risks, including risks that result in events that may threaten the organisation's business model, future performance, solvency and reputation. This includes considering emerging exposures, and a clear trend is emerging to hold directors to account for failure to address, take account of or mitigate against these emerging risks. The problem with emerging risks, of course, is that they do tend to change fairly regularly. We take climate change as an example. Some of the allegations that can be levelled against directors include breaching their fiduciary duties and not considering the financial risks associated with those risks, failure to comply with legislative reporting requirements, which are moving towards being mandatory, failure to disclose climate change liabilities, disseminating false or misleading or incomplete information on climate risk, mismanagement of climate-related risks, and negligence in allowing the company to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, of course, if we'd been doing this talk some months ago, climate change really would have been very high up there as an emerging risk, and it remains high, but at the same time, it's unlikely that many boards are looking at climate change with any real specificity at the moment, given the issues that we are living in. And that, I think, is a very good demonstration of how emerging risks can fundamentally change. And it places great onus on boards to make sure that they are considering changing emerging risks as soon as they spot a change out there in the wider economy and the wider country. Turning then to compliance with evolving digital regulation, some of the other members of the panel have been talking in more detail about cyber, how it impacts upon reputation, in particular cyber reliance, etc. But there have, of course, been changes in the digital regulation itself. It's been identified within the Airmic report. Compliance with evolving digital regulation is high up there on the list of trends. Cybersecurity needs to be at the top of the board's agenda already, but with the resources and attention being diverted to handle the crisis, companies may be left exposed. There's also the risk that the increase in remote working can create new cybersecurity concerns and expose the company its data. And we heard that in a lot more detail and with a lot more authority from John earlier. Companies and Ds and Os may be exposed to extensive liability if they fail to adequately process or safeguard personal data. I'm hoping that you've all had a huge amount of GDPR training in the past, so I'm not going to look at that in any real detail, but the primary exposure under GDPR following a data breach is a regulatory or administrative action by the relevant data protection authority. In the UK, it's the ICO for breaches of the GDPR. And in the UK, we have our own statute, the Data Protection Act 2018, such that it is unlikely that Brexit is going to have any real impact upon the impact of, or the influence of GDPR upon our regulators. Should a data breach occur, the ICO has many enforcement tools at its disposal, various investigation powers, the power to demand information and obtain access to data and premises, corrective powers such as the power to issue warnings, reprimands and bans on protesting, but of course the ability to issue fines. And it's the power to issue fines that has grabbed the headlines, given the level of fines that can now be imposed. Very, very significant hike from previous maximum levels. After a relatively slow start, the data protection authorities are demonstrating that they are willing to use the full force of their powers to enforce or to ensure compliance. And we've already seen some large fines imposed on global companies. Can only expect this to continue. And then finally,
James, I'm sorry to sort of interrupt you. It's Julia here. We've only got 15 minutes left of the webinar. And I wonder if you would forgive me if I sort of cut you at that point, because I'm just a bit concerned that I would like some time left at the end, if I may, to ask a few questions. So if we could sort of wrap up in the next minute, that would be very helpful.
Yes, I'll do that, because the last one really is class actions. I just wanted to round that off briefly by discussing shareholder litigation risk, because shareholder activism has been on the rise in this country for a long time. Plethora of corporate scandals in recent years, and what we are seeing in particular is the development of third-party litigation funders and also some legislative reform to make class actions much easier. Class actions are a bigger concern in other jurisdictions like the US and Australia and Canada in particular, but consumer-facing industries, there is now the ability to bring a class action on behalf of a wider class than ever before. Shareholder class actions are still relatively uncommon in this country, mainly because our processes and procedures don't make it very easy to do that. But again, this increased regulatory involvement, the increased shareholder activism, litigation funders, means that class actions are on the rise here. They will never be at the same level as the US, thankfully, but they are something to at least bear in mind. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks very much indeed, James. And I'm going to quickly ask the three panelists who've got camera access to switch their webcams on and come back onto the stage. I can see Dan up there with James, and John is back up there with the other James. And I know that Elizabeth's there in the background. So thank you very much indeed for all of your wise words. Really do appreciate that. I've got a couple of questions that I sort of want to pose to you collectively. So I'm going to pick on Dan Truman first, but I think this is a question that I'm going to ask you all to comment on. Dan, you know, from all of your angles, many organisations look at the time of a pandemic as a time to sort of retrench, you know, save money on operational overheads, and there are also examples of others turning the situation into opportunity and coming out better and stronger, and quite right. How can organisations, do you think, turn such radical disruption and uncertainty to their advantage? Do you have any sort of comments about, you know, arriving at the next normal stronger and better than the situation you were in before you went into the situation we're in now?
Yeah, I think particularly, you know, looking at the lens that I've been carrying at this, but also that broader lens, I think this is a really good opportunity for organisations to act with an authenticity and to communicate with an authenticity that is alongside their aims, their needs, their wants, and actually to show that consistency of action, that consistency of a measured approach, and to really deliver. You know, this is a time to walk the talk. And I think the organisations that certainly in conversations, certainly picked up in the press, those organisations that are delivering on what they're saying and are you know, look at the new normal as a way to come forward, are going to be those who come out of this stronger.
Mm. And thank you, Dan. And James Endersby, I mean, authenticity sounds a little bit sort of up your street in terms of some of the work that your organisation have done. Do you want to build on Dan's comments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd like to focus on sort of leading with purpose and empathy, perhaps. I think you mentioned a lot of organizations retrenching staff and how they can emerge stronger, etc. And I think in terms of leading with purpose and empathy, I think it's vital during uncertain times. For instance, during her premiership, Jacinda Ardern has dealt with a volcanic eruption, a major terrorist attack, and a pandemic. And she's an absolute role model in terms of her empathy and understanding, but also in how she's leading her people by being resolute in times of crisis. I think this post-COVID age will be a time for senior leaders to reflect on their business purpose and how we connect with our most important asset, which is our people.
Thank you. And in fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut to John Meakin, and John, I'm going to ask you something. We made quite a lot in the opening comments and in the report about connected risks and blended threats, and this might lead to a comment from others as well, but we hear a lot about blended threats that mix physical and cyber insecurities and are increasingly bringing risks to businesses. But is this real? And what type of risks have you seen?
Yes, so thank you, Julia. Yeah, it's definitely real. So, you know, if you read the news headlines, the cyber threat is all about the hackers in South America or even in their bedroom in the UK, sort of working by themselves. The most dangerous threats are those that are perpetrated by organized crime. I alluded to that earlier. And organized criminals conduct sophisticated attacks. Sophisticated attacks have multiple stages. Increasingly, even if the target of those attacks is the intrusion into a system and the theft of electronic data, increasingly some of the stages in those attacks, particularly the ones that are, if you like, in surveillance and trying to gather information to further the course of an attack, increasingly those involve physical action. Whether it's approaching staff or agents who work on behalf of the business to befriend them and tap them as for sources of information, or whether it's actual physical intrusion to properties and premises. I have a great example from my own past of an attack on a high value luxury goods boutique, which actually involved it was sort of turns the blended threat the other way around. There was an intrusion into the surveillance systems that were operated in those boutiques, cybersecurity intrusion, which allowed attackers to turn those surveillance systems off and then perpetrate a physical attack with a sledgehammer on the boutique and get away scot-free with a significant value haul. So blended attacks are more common than you think, are one of the growing themes. And you don't need physical security and cybersecurity people to be in the same organization to tackle them effectively, but you do need some sort of joined up response.
Thank you. And on the joined up sort of response angle, I'm going to sort of turn to James Endersby with a resilience question. James, we've been saying at Airmic that risk professionals who can be agile and good leaders are going to respond to the challenges as we face the future and coming out of lockdown. What advice would you give to organisations that want to build and rebuild resilience in the post-COVID-19 world through the lens of resilience? Do you have any comments that you could share?
Yeah, thanks. Just a few quick comments in terms of what risk professionals and leaders can do to emerge strongly. Well, firstly, I think now and in the future, and this is perhaps a wider organizational thing as well, and thinking about future risks, I think risk professionals and leaders need to ensure they constantly make time to get up on the balcony, so to speak, and scan for weak signals out there, especially with the second wave potentially coming. And I think leaders need to take time to do that. You know, they get obviously stuck into the daily work, especially now. It's pretty intense. But don't forget to take time to step back, I think in terms of what people can do, what leaders can do personally as well, is to prioritize personal resilience. I think it kind of gets lost in all of this. You know, your own personal resilience. We're hearing stories of leaders and professionals who are burning out during this period. You know, it is intense, juggling many things, not just work. And I think as we emerge, I think people need to get back and think about that, because you can't perform you know, to a high level unless you look after yourself. And then just in terms of communicating to teams, etc., effective communication is absolutely essential. We're still in lockdown, really, in terms of most professional services businesses anyway. So communicating with your teams is so important, with Zooms and Skypes, and but I think they need to communicate with greater intensity and regularity as well, because if a leader is not communicating on a regular basis, people can make false assumptions. I mentioned leading with purpose and empathy, which I'll just bring back in. And I guess finally, give away control. So it's the whole point of devolving decisions to those on the ground, especially during a crisis. And those businesses thinking into the future need to be able to operate like that. So teams instinctively know clients, they know local market conditions, project responsibilities, etc. So they should be the best people to implement strategy. The job of a leader is to be strategic, set direction, communicate, and then let go.
Thank you. And that gives a thought for a question that we've had that links in quite nicely to Elizabeth. Because Elizabeth, people can have great radars and they can be good leaders and sensitive leaders on the ground. But what can you share with organisations about the impact of today's geopolitical risks? Because what some of our members tell us is that they can see they're there, but they feel a bit helpless, because when they're trying to address these risks, they feel that they're often something that's beyond their control and influence. Do you have any thoughts that you could share about that scenario, or any advice that you could give? I don't know if Elizabeth is there. Maybe you're on mute. Okay, I'm going to assume that we may have lost Elizabeth. So
no,
it is.
Now it worked.
There. Oh, go on, yeah. Elizabeth.
I cannot recommend GoToWebinar on iPhone. It's I just can't recommend it. So that's a very good question, Julia, and that's something I've seen and heard from a lot of industry leaders as well, that they are observing, witnessing, experiencing a lot of results of geopolitical tension, and yet they are essentially on their own, because there is this is such a new thing. Obviously, combined aggression is not new. There has been a component of wars since times immemorial, but this idea that another country and its helpers can engage in aggression outside the context of war, that is something that we haven't seen like this before. And so you have industry leaders essentially exposed to sort of picking up the pieces of this geopolitical tension. I think that the best way of addressing it is by having much closer cooperation between governments and industry leaders. And I'll say this very quickly because we only have 1.5 minutes left, but the US government, or rather different US government departments, have a very good system. For example, the DOE, so the Department of Energy, where they regularly invite business leaders and give them classified briefings about current national security threats, and with no sort of instructions for them, and it's not a commercial relationship either. It's business leaders in the utility sector, and I think that's a very useful model, because that gives the industry leaders a better understanding of the sort of threats that are happening, or the forms of aggression that are happening, and also forms a sort of relationship where in a true crisis, in a real world crisis, government leaders and industry leaders would seamlessly be able to team up, not just on they wouldn't have to sort of hurry up and consult various cooperation agreements, but would actually have that sort of relationship where they would be able to act together in an efficient and swift manner.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. And I'm going to leave the last minute and turn to James on governance. James, a lot of our members describe the current insurance market for D&O insurance as brutal, with increases in premiums spiralling and limitations in cover almost out of control. So final word to you, top tip on what organisations and risk professionals can do at this time with regards to D&O liability. And if I can just give you a minute to do that, and then after that, James, no pressure, I'm going to very quickly wrap up and summarise events, and but give you that minute if you've got a pearl of wisdom you would like to share with us.
Okay, I've got three, and I've asked some underwriters because I was aware this question was going to be asked. So this is coming from the horse's mouth. 3 words: engagement, openness, and a degree of understanding. That's more than 3 words, but you get where I'm coming from. At the moment, you've got underwriters who are wanting to do business with you. They are, however, in a situation where their books are under pressure. And I think it's a degree of understanding. Yes, there are very tough renewal terms for many, but D&O books were suffering before the pandemic and rates were rising before the pandemic. The recession that is likely or is following the lockdown has all the signs of being deep. That'll result in very significant claims volumes, particularly in relation to corporate insolvencies and how that impacts upon D&O. So those books are already suffering and they're only going to get more challenging. And it is important that books of business are profitable. Otherwise, you know, whilst a D&O underwriter wants to provide you with capacity, if they can't get capacity from their management, you will not be able to buy as much insurance as you want. So I think it is understanding that it's tough renewal terms, and that is because books are unprofitable. This is not because people are trying to make hay. It's also engagement and understanding. Standard proposal forms are less used now. What I was hearing from underwriters is they're having to use their guts more. They don't just want to link to your finances. Brokers need to sell you as a proposition, and you need to be getting your underwriters' attention by getting in front of them. Underwriters are human beings. They like to understand the people who are behind the business. So anything you can do to get in front of the underwriters is going to really help them get comfortable with your business and give you the best terms that they can possibly give you.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank all of our panel for being with us today. Some super comments from, as you could see, from a great team of experts. And we'd like to thank you very much for being with us today. I'd also like to thank the audience that we've had online today and for taking the time to be with us. What I'd like to say just briefly in conclusion is that unfortunately for all of our panel, I have your email addresses and I've got more questions that we have not had the full opportunity to pursue today. Loads of questions coming through. So I'm going to contact you. And if you can spare a few minutes and map out a couple of answers, then we will post those answers. And where we will post them is in our marvellous new resource centre, which is the Airmic Megatrends Resource Centre, which you can see on the slide now. If you take the time to go to that centre after this presentation today, you will find the report. You will find the report that James spoke to earlier on as well, and you will see that we've started to populate information for each of those megatrends as a legacy for you to go and explore information on these subjects further. Now, one other final comment I'm going to make, because you might have thought, well, it's a bit strange. One of the biggest megatrends is climate change, but you haven't covered it today. Well, don't be disappointed, because on the 9th of December, Airmic is taking a day out to focus solely on climate change, and we're going to be running a forum that day when we will explore climate change challenges in greater depth. So please save that date in your diaries, and more information about that will follow. But of course, before then, we're going to see you all at Airmic Fest, our online digital conference, on the 22nd to the 24th of September. So we will see you there. So once again, to our panel, thank you very much indeed for being with us today. We will make a recording of this webinar available and the slides that go with it. So thank you very much indeed, and do take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.